So we'll get started. My name's David Colby Reed. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and why I'm doing this stuff and what gives me standing to talk about it in a moment. But I want to talk about the potential for authoritarian governance and social relations in space as we're thinking about futures here and so on. And I also want to lay out a hypothesis for what might help entrench more democratic norms and ways of social equality in our future space environment. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And just by way of anchoring, I want to start with this, with a scene from the Migration series by Jacob Lawrence. This is one of my favorite paintings and so on. I mean, has anyone read Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns? I see some, just an excellent treatment of the Great Migration, but it describes the many paths that millions, I think it's roughly 6 million Black folks from the South moving to northern and western cities in the interwar period. And there's this large internal migration. I put this up here because I think about some of the forces that had these folks leave the South. They were fleeing domestic terrorism. They were pursuing economic and political equality. I think about that as I start thinking about the ways in which, the factors that might push humans to live and work in future space habitations. And so if I can amend the original a little bit, just hold on to this image as we go through the talk. There are a couple of times that I'll ask you just to hold on to a few things because I want to weave together a few thoughts. So who am I? I'm David Colby Reed. We're running low on time, so I won't actually run through my thing. But in pertinent part, I want to say that I'm a designer. I started design practice with my partner, Lishan Huang here. And these days, I'm also doing research at the MIT Media Lab in a research group called Space Enabled. And the mission of the Space Enabled Research Group is to advance justice in Earth's complex systems using designs enabled by space, like outer space. So that's how I started thinking about some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today about space. So the way that I view my work is that I work to build equity into the architectures of socio-technical systems. We can unpack that later on as we go. But the big idea is that systems produce patterns of relationships between people, and I'm interested in the kinds of system designs that allow for more equitable relationships between people. And that's my big motivating question. And the big question for today's session is egalitarian social relations in space. One way of thinking about that is, how do you quit your job when you work in space? When you can't just say, I quit and walk out because you don't have oxygen or pressure or radiation shielding and all the rest. We're going to talk about some of those things. A related question here is, how might we entrench democratic relations in our space habitations and economies? So I'm going to talk about space stuff, but I think there's some background that bridges the present to some of these more speculative futures. And so that's what I want to talk about first. So I want to use the automotive era as an extended analogy and a way of introducing some terms and principles that I think will help clarify some of our thinking about human relations in space. So how might we have considered private automobile ownership at the start of this 20th century, knowing what we know now? Some background. What do we know now? This is from a book by Samuel Schwartz, who's like this traffic czar in New York in the 70s and 80s, and he's thinking about autonomous vehicles and how they'll sort of change some of the landscape of roads and so on. He's trying to imagine going back to the beginning of the 20th century and talking to a pedestrian and trying to explain to this person that in a few years, the government will flash a light in your face that tells you where on a narrow strip of the street you can cross after hugging the block and hugging buildings while walking to your destination. And that if you fail to comply with these rules, you can be subject to sanctions, violation, and fines and all the rest. And this would be inconceivable to a person of that time. It would read something like contemporary science fiction of the era, right? It would beggar belief, right? And so what else do we know about the automotive era? In addition to the personal and immediate kinds of stakes of the sort that we were just describing there, we can see that technologies change our legal systems. So here we have a quotation from a great essay in the New Yorker recently by Nathan Heller, where he's articulating this dilemma, right? That sane, upstanding pedestrians didn't murder one another as they ran errands around town, but sane, upstanding drivers did or could at any moment. And so we needed a new type of policing and new legal arrangements to affect the rules of the road, as it were, right? There's Professor Sarasio, University of Iowa, who argues, and pretty persuasively in my opinion, that our entire Fourth Amendment jurisprudence concerning search and seizure has been remade in the image of the automotive era. Like, how do you think about a big 2-ton private space on public roads that impacts public safety? How do you think about searching? Like, actually, some of the first search and seizure cases here for cars had to do with bootlegging and during the Prohibition era and so on. And like, what are the grounds for searching and so on? So that's one thing. Another thing that we know, when we're thinking about the automotive era, is that economics changed the different types of ownership structures and social relations of given technology. So electric vehicles predated internal combustion vehicles, and they were more popular in some years in the early 20th century. And they were considerably more expensive, though. So you had different business models emerging during that time. Like 120 years before Uber and Lyft and so on, most of the business models for electric vehicles were shared ownership or, fleets of electric vehicles being part of like the city infrastructure network. And it wasn't until the introduction of the Model T that lowered the unit cost of cars such that individual households could have their own cars. And that changed the entire dynamic of the car ecosystem, right? What else do we know? In some U.S. cities, this is from an urban planning professor at MIT. Like in some cities, he's found that roughly a third of the built environment is dedicated to parking. So technologies can shape our cultures and our built environments. So that's another thing that we know from analogies to the automotive era, right? Marshall McLuhan and others have been, this phrase has been attributed to him and others, but like, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. So this is part of the dynamic as we're thinking about technologies. And then finally, there are human costs and human terms to the way in which automobile ownership and usage has evolved in this country. In the last 10 years and change in the US, we've had 3.5 million people die in automobile accidents, another 80 million who have been injured or maimed in car accidents. And back to Nathan Heller's essay here, the road has emerged as the setting for our most violent illustrations of systemic racism. Combustion engines have helped to create a climate crisis, and the quest for oil has led our soldiers into war. So we've really remade our world in the image of this particular technology, following the dictates of that technology and the ownership structure concerning the technology. That ownership structure is an example of a socio-technical system. And so that's what I mean when I talk about this, right? And so I want to introduce two more sets of terms, authoritarian and democratic techniques. This language comes from Lewis Mumford, a scholar of science, technology, and society. I see some nods because we're in a design school. This is awesome. I will give a quick example, though. I grew up on Long Island, right around here. I think the parkway system on Long Island illustrates some of these ideas about democratic and authoritarian technique. You see the parkways connect in a lot of Long Island. You grow up driving on these every day. But they were part of a system of roads built by this master urban planner, Robert Moses. I'm sure we all know Moses, right? And note the clearances on these overpasses over the Long Island parkways, right? 7 feet, 7 inches there, 9 feet and change here. This was also around the time that the interstate highway system was being built and the overpasses there are considerably higher, right? Why is that? I mean, part of Moses's motivation for stipulating the design of these overpasses was that he wanted to preserve racial segregation patterns. Long Island suburbs were largely white. You had black folks living in New York City. Moses worked to kill a train line that would connect New York City to Jones Beach so that black residents couldn't get to the beach that way. And we saw to it that the overpasses were constructed such that buses, in which black folks who live in the city and did not own private cars, could not get to access Long Island. And growing up on Long Island, every few years there'd be something like this, where a bus becomes a convertible because someone doesn't take the right exit or so on. So this is a way in which we can have an architecture embedding political arrangements and political sensibilities. So I want to illustrate that point, and I think this is a pretty visceral example of it, right? Architectures can embed politics, and they can be hard-coded into a system in question. Another example of how architectures can embed politics or technologies can embed politics is seen in nuclear power. So sometimes it just makes sense to have tight systems of control and different political arrangements. Imagine a nuclear power plant, and you don't want that fissile material walking out. You don't want a reactor meltdown. So there are lots of tight systems of control, very circumscribed access controls about who can go where, about routines and so on that manage people who work in these settings. And so this is a way in which we can see technology itself can embed a certain kind of political arrangement. So what other things might we distill from this automotive kind of example and as we're doing these analogies? I mean, one is that the features, in this case, cost of a given technology, this is internal combustion versus electric engines, can drive patterns of usage and ownership. And that's important as we think about space stuff as well. So one way to kind of sum it up is by referencing the work of the STS scholar Lewis Mumford, who argued that there are two types of technologies, basically, one authoritarian and the other democratic. The authoritarian technologies are system-centered, immensely powerful, but inherently unstable, and the other is man-centered or human-centered, relatively weak, but resourceful and durable. So that's about democratic and authoritarian techniques in technologies. How might these experiences help us think about space? Well, according to Lewis Mumford and Langdon Winter, another STS scholar who elaborated on some of Mumford's thesis, I suggest that the technologies required for human life beyond Earth have an embedded authoritarian politics, much like the nuclear power plant example. The space environment is lethal, vast, and abundant with materials, but those materials can only be processed as inputs for survival, economic activity, transportation, and the like through really capital-intensive, like machine-assisted processes. For the foreseeable future, human activities in space will require technological mediation. Sound will be heard via microphones and speakers, which means that it's subject to always-on recording. Air pressure and air content will be monitored and adjusted by artificially intelligent agents. Cosmic radiation will be managed by routines, structures, and garments that will insulate humans from their external environments by controlling their movements. Although it's possible to imagine a future in which the costs of these technologies decline, you're still going to have this fundamental authoritarian politics to them in the definition of Mumford and Winter, because they require organizing human behaviors and human activities into tightly circumscribed routines. You don't deviate from your routine in the nuclear power plant or on a space station, because if you do, if you stop following orders, then you can die. And so there's good reason for that, but it's just, I think, descriptively accurate to call these authoritarian technologies because you're organizing folks in that way. So what are some of the features of the space environment? Briefly, let's run through them. Space is big, it's lethal, absent technological mediation, resource poor, absent technological mediation, and it's heavily influenced by gravity, and that changes the economics of the space environment. And so I'm going to run through some of these examples pretty quickly because we'll have some more opportunity to discuss them later on. But space is this big, it's really big. We talk about enormous scales for transportation, which means lags in communication. It means that it's expensive to get from point A to point B, so travel will be restricted in certain ways, right? Space is dangerous. Space can kill you in a bunch of ways, quite apart from the lack of oxygen and so on. There's an enormous amount of radiation. There's cosmic rays and, like there are solar flares and so on. This is an illustration from space.com, I believe, showing some of the threats of radiation in the space environment. So cancer and other things are big issues. You see in a vacuum, bodily fluids can boil even if they don't escape the skin. And so, because of the pressure differential and so on, so it can be very painful to be exposed to some of these pressure differentials. In low Earth orbit, you have lots of junk flying around at 17,000 miles per hour. So a fleck of paint can knock out a small satellite or something, so it's dangerous in that way. You see suppressed and diminished immune response. Oh, this is about the effects of microgravity on the human body. You see deformation of some organs and so on. It's difficult to heal in microgravity if you're injured. You see suppressed immune responses as well. And so this is a NASA study that says that the immune system is dazed and confused during spaceflight. And so microgravity is a dangerous environment. There are many environmental risks that need to be controlled for in space. So to the point about like the specialized technologies that you'll need, this is the Deep Horizon drilling rig, right? Like think about what you need for offshore drilling, very specialized machinery, very expensive machinery, so it's capital intensive, and your space will be that squared, right? Finally, XKCD, who's invaluable as ever, illustrates one of the last points I want to make about the features of the space environment, namely that gravity will influence the cost of launches and will influence the economics of any kind of operation in space. This illustration shows the relative gravity wells. In pertinent part, I think we should just focus on the Earth and the Moon, for example. So you can see it's highlighted here, but to escape the Moon's gravity well, you need to go out 288 kilometers. To escape the Earth's gravity well, it's something like 6,400 kilometers, right? That's very expensive in terms of fuel, and it means that it's actually, as this cartoon illustrates, like the astronauts, when the Apollo missions went to the moon, they needed enormous amounts of fuel to get there and very little fuel to get back because of the effects of gravity. That influences the economics for landing on asteroids to conduct mining operations as well. And so gravity influences how you approach and so on. So you have these external environmental factors shaping the ways that activities will be undertaken in space. So to sum up this section of the conversation, right? Designs can incorporate political arrangements. Those arrangements can skew democratic or authoritarian based on their internal structure and the institutions necessary for managing them. And the features of the space environment likely will encode an authoritarian techniques because they require that kind of adherence to routine and so on, and very tightly circumscribed activity. So if the built environment can encode social hierarchy, how do we think about the effects in space habitations and space workplaces? So much like our hypothetical person traveling back in time 120 years to talk to someone about the beginning of the automotive era, how do we think now about the 150 years in the future when humans will be active in space and the space economy will be growing and so on? How do we think about the features of that space environment influencing our civilization in the ways that we saw in the car example? So we talked about some of the biophysical dimensions of the space environment. I think it's important to consider some of the social ones as well. And so I want to start with a brief discussion of like some relevant law. The Outer Space Treaty, signed by every major spacefaring country and many, many others besides, and ratified in 1967, stipulates that space will be, like the exploration and use of space will be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, and shall be the province of all mankind. Outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or any other means. So the idea is that space belongs to everyone, and its use should be for the benefit of everyone. That's the essential part of these two articles of the Outer Space Treaty. We've seen some recent policy changes, however. And so in 2015, the US passed the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act. And the purpose of this act was to mobilize more private resources for space exploration and other space activities. So here, any US citizen, in this case a corporate citizen launching from the US, counts as a US citizen, right? Shall be entitled to any asteroid resource or space resource obtained, including to possess, own, transport, use, and sell that asteroid resource. So I think that the Outer Space Treaty and the Space Resource Utilization Act and so on are in extraordinary tension with one another. And I think that we haven't done an adequate job of exploring that tension in a lot of our debate concerning this. The US passed that law in 2015. Luxembourg followed with its own in 2016. Oman might be next. So there's increasing momentum for like a kind of like race to the bottom, in my opinion, for some of these standards. The 2015 law imagines that space resources will be used for private gain. And so I want to give the example from this book, Ecology of Law, by a physicist and legal scholar who are pretty critical of some of the ways in which capitalism has translated commons, basically, things that were the province of all mankind, to use the language of the Outer Space Treaty, and has turned them into private goods. And they argue that the intensity of that process of transforming commons into capital has been unprecedented over the last 100 years and has created conditions of enormous material wealth in the world, but it has also caused a lot of disruption and pain in the process. Demon sheep illustrate this phenomenon of enclosure. I mean, this is a GIF captured from a 2010 political ad. It was Carly Fiorina's Senate run in California. Back in 2010, this was weird as all hell, and now, it seems innocent. But it was something about like fiscal conservatives or like sheep, that are hiding among fake fiscal conservatives. It was a little unclear. But the idea of demon sheep it harkens back to a book by Sir Thomas More, who was a jurist and chancellor of the early courts of equity in England. And so he's writing in the 16th century about the contemporaneous process of enclosure of commons. So he writes that your sheep, which are naturally mild, may now be said to devour men and unpeople, because they stop the course of agriculture and enclose grounds that may lodge. Basically, he's describing this process in which there were these commons, these lands held in common that were owned by no one in particular, that the peasantry would use to grow food and hunt game and so on. And as these lands were enclosed for more private usage, in this case for sheep, so that they could graze on them, produce more wool, and fuel the English Industrial Revolution by, the textile revolution that made England into a world power. This caused people to starve, and it caused massive displacement. And this is what the process of converting commons into capital can entail. And so Thomas More writing about how sheep can devour men in this instance. And I think that was a really evocative way of saying, in other words, that markets can leave their mark and crowd out other values worth caring about. And the way that markets can do that is through the social technology of law. In this case, the law of private ownership and property, and the ways that law has been used to advance these private and enclosed private goods. So we're going to go to this quotation for a sec and focus on the Neil deGrasse Tyson one for a sec. He's already anticipating a space future in which you'll have trillionaires who are capturing all this wealth that was supposed to be for the benefit of all mankind, right? For the province of all humankind. He's imagining that we'll see trillionaires capitalizing and turning into capital assets that are on asteroids, right? So this is mined minerals and so on, but also water in particular. And we see other folks who are gearing up for this as well. And this is a screenshot from Planetary Resources, an asteroid mining company. At other points on their website, they gloat about how they were able to get that 2015 law passed and lobbied for it and so on. But water detected 7% or 16%. Well, water is special in the space context. Sorry, as an aside, we're talking about how big space is and how expensive fuel is in space. Water can be decomposed into hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen fuel cells can power, machinery, can charge batteries, and also act as rocket fuel and propellant and so on. Water is necessary for human use and survival as well. So water could be the key resource in space habitations and economies. And this is what Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, was referring to when he imagines the moon as a kind of gas station for the rest of the solar system. That, like lunar ice caps can be mined for their ice, and then that becomes an area that we can use to project further, in part owing to the physics of gravity and getting out of gravity well, right? So this is ways in which some of this stuff begins to come together. Is that clear, by the way? I think this stuff creates the conditions for what Thomas Piketty described as R is greater than G. I see some folks nodding, right? Like the big doorstopper of a book a few years ago, Capital in the 21st Century, his big argument, this economist was arguing that the reason why the rich keep getting richer is because the returns to capital, R, exceed the rate of economic growth. So if you own capital assets, the returns on those capital assets will outpace economic growth, and you will be richer proportionally to the rest of the population. And that's the central phenomenon that he traced over centuries of modern economies. It's an instance of compounding advantage that's based on just economic realities. And then the question becomes, should these men control access to the rest of the solar system? And I see some, you can imagine how, well, anyway, I won't talk about how I feel just yet, but I think it's worth meditating on that question, right? And so what have we learned in this section? That capitalism has required the enclosure of non-market assets and turning them into private goods, right? That law is a kind of social technology that can affect those enclosures. Space, which is meant to be used for the benefit of all mankind, is a big pile of commons that are being ready to be enclosed upon by actors who are mobilizing now. And that sets us on a path where, given the scale of resources, the bigness of space, there's so many more resources that we'll see compounding advantage quite rapidly, I suspect. So what might an alternative or complementary system of value in economic systems look like? And that's what I want to explore in this section. There are two basic dimensions of analysis when we're thinking about types of goods, right? You can think about the subtractability of use and the difficulty of exclusion. This comes from work by Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues, and I think she won the Nobel Prize in 2005 in economics for some of this stuff. We're talking about how you manage common pool resources. But just to define briefly, I mean, you get the idea of like what a private good is, right? Like my computer is a private good. I own it and you don't have it because it's mine, right? Public goods are things like air, or air quality rather, like that. These are things that are best left to governments to coordinate because the subtractability of use is low. We're all in this room breathing air, and that doesn't preclude anyone else from breathing air, right? And the difficulty of exclusion is high. I can't stop you breathing air unless I stop you breathing, which would be a problem. And in the case of common pool resources, the subtractability of use is high and the difficulty of exclusion is high. And so common pool resources are things like fisheries or forests or networks of asteroids with mineral wealth and so on, that it's difficult to exclude people from accessing them. But if you overfish a section of the sea, right, like there are not enough fish for someone else. Like the subtractability of use is high. And so that's this idea about common pool resources. And so Ostrom and her colleagues studied extensively the ways in which common pool resources are managed and what kinds of institutions are good at managing common pool resources, because they're not good with private ownership regimes. That's how you get the tragedy of the commons for those of you who like economics, right? But it's also harder for governments to do this because they require lots of monitoring. I'm not going to talk too much about the institutions for common pool resource management because that's something I'm actively thinking about and working on right now. But the upshot is that the best ways to manage common pool resources in Ostrom's extensive surveys of how they've been managed are that you have users of the resource participating in the management of those resources collectively, that you have visibility into who's using the resource, and that there are sanctioning powers associated with the individuals who are using it. So, please.
Could possibly, even though it is a privately owned thing, could I consider Uber to be a common pool resource?
It depends on how. What part of Uber are we talking about, right? Because
right, because it's privately owned, but it is a common thing for workers, the drivers, to have some monetary value that they can extract from it. You get what I'm saying? So, is that portion of it maybe considered a common pool, or is that too complicated to fit in that category?
I think there's some difficulty slating Uber in there because there are a few different, for any kind of platform business model like that, you have the platform itself, which is, Uber's database of drivers and passengers, using satellite data to figure out where everyone is and so on. You have algorithms that route drivers through particular locations. And so that could be like intellectual property, and that works pretty well as a private good,
okay.
The IP for doing that. But they're using public roads, which is a public good, and so this is why cities try to limit, or I'm from New York, right? And so you have to be basically a full-time Uber or Lyft driver in New York. You don't see many part-time folks doing it in the city. They require different licenses, to operate a vehicle for Uber or Lyft, right? So you see different facets of the business falling into different quadrants. I don't know if that's a satisfactory response,
but I think it's good for right now. I don't want to derail.
Oh no, but it's important to ask it. Oh, and this is a belated thing, and I thank you for asking. Ask questions anytime. I really appreciate you thinking this through and trying to fit these business models into this framework. So thank you. So we were talking about how common pool resources are managed and the institutions necessary for managing them. They share a few characteristics, right? That the users can manage the common pool resource, can observe other folks acting and using the common pool resource, and there's a sanctioning power associated with that as well. So if you're not supposed to be fishing during certain months of the year when fish are spawning or something, and you see that one of your competitors is doing that, you can sanction them by saying like, hey, they're violating the terms of this space, so they are forbidden from fishing there or whatever. That's what that observation and sanctioning power is like. My hypothesis is that maybe we should think about space-based materials as a special class of common pool resources. There's the question then of like, what are the governance institutions necessary for thinking about common pool resources in space? There are issues of getting the scale and membership of the management organizations right for common pool resources in space, but I think that framework can be helpful as we're thinking about this. So that was the point I wanted to make about space assets being common pool resources. What was your point?
I read a lot of sci-fi, and I feel like the giant arc is generally across them is just like empire in space.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like, I read this hypothesis and I'm like, okay, well, before even getting to this, like, what's the point of even being in space? Like, what would be the point of,
why space?
Why space, but also what's the impetus to get there? And like, I think that determines if we can even ask if it could be a common pool resource.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think at the current moment, there's no need to go to space, but there is a big need to like just grab things from it if we think there's a need to grab resources from there. So like, if at some point in the near future, society breaks down and the only way out is up,
Mm-hmm.
a direction, then I think that will kind of tell us what it can be. Because what might end up happening is that we may end up in a situation where it has to be private, because the only way we can get out of here is because Blue Origin or whoever is the one who can get us out of there, right?
So we're already seeing folks doing stuff in space. Like the space economy is roughly $300 billion now. It's estimated in a decade to be about $1 trillion and so on. A lot of the work that's being done in space that has immediate economic value concerns stuff in low Earth orbit. So there are communication satellites, imaging satellites, and so on. We use space for weather prediction. We use space for getting our lifts and getting matched on use your app of choice, right? Like, these are all space-based technologies on some level or another. And you're starting to see, as we saw a couple slides ago, like folks like Planetary Resources, and there was a chart I didn't talk about with, there are a bunch of companies that are getting into the space mining field because there's just such an enormous wealth of mineral resources in space. But once you're in space, the mineral resources become less important than some of the other things like water, which are useful for human survival, but also propulsion to other parts of the solar system. So there are forces already at work that are militating in favor of that kind of expansion. But if we also go back to that great migration photo from painting from the beginning, I could see other factors driving people to space, and we can talk about them later. But I wanted to be responsive to these things.
No, I appreciate it. First of all, thank you very much, because in 8th grade, I wanted to mine space junk because that was a private market for me. I just keep thinking, though, about a time, living in LA or Oklahoma, where a guy just owned a well. You know what I mean? And so I don't know how hard it was to do that, but then there was a market in the end that sort of set the price, and everything so it was sort of democratic in some way in the beginning, right? If you own the land, you could do a well and oil came out, you're like, yay, I got it, right? But then the movement of the good and the pricing of the good ended up impacting the ability of crowding out people, right? That the economies of scale pushed it. So I don't know what I was saying about that. But there was a moment for us for extraction where someone could look on the ground and say, yay, I can get this myself. But then how do I put that into the market to use it? Does this make sense?
Yeah, I mean, oil is an interesting example, right? Because that's another thing think about a balloon filled with water, right? If you stick a straw in the balloon filled with water, like water will come up through the straw initially because there's a lot of pressure there. But as the pressure declines, less water will come up. So you have to like push harder on that balloon to get water out. So too with oil, right? So like early like 20th century kinds of oil mining and so on, extraction in like, oh, I struck oil in my backyard, that kind of thing. Like that can happen in an environment where there's a fairly high pressure underground and oil is easily accessible. Increasingly, the oil that folks get is harder to access. I mean, that's the Canadian tar sand stuff and so on, where it's more difficult to extract, or you see like offshore drilling rigs in the North Sea and so on, because you have to go miles off the coast and you've got to go like, miles underwater to get to oil because it's harder because there's less of it. One more thing, and I might not respond now, but I might try to bundle it. Was your
Sure. So it's a really interesting hypothesis about space-based materials being common pool resources. But I wonder how you think about that, given that access and transport to space is either going to be a toll resource where, if you think about transit, like on Earth, like it's really hard to build public transit as a private resource because you don't have enough return on your investment. And so you end up with sort of this like clause because it ends up being like a toll resource that's like not easily excludable. Anyway, or it becomes a private resource and you're having companies like Blue Origin or SpaceX build the actual transportation to space. So how are you thinking about the economics of this if the resources are common, but the ability to get there is not? It's very privatized.
And that's a part that I'm not considering in this talk, but that's an excellent question, right? And I think that right now we're in this weird hybrid stage where you have states partnering with private entities, especially in the U.S., and to do launches. I mean, right now, like the U.S. uses like Russian launches to get astronauts up to the ISS and things like that, right? But eventually there will be more private capacity to do that, and that's what SpaceX is under contract for, and so on, right? Eventually, I think that if the assets themselves are going to be considered common pool resources and will have a different management structure and so on. I don't know which forms for launches would be best. I don't know what the economics of launches might be for a private actor, but I also wonder like how private is any actor over the next 100 years going to be in space, given like the enormous costs. I mean, you have this kind of like monopsony pricing and so on when your only client is the government and so on, or like super rich tourists for space tourism, but that's an edge case. I mean, most of the stuff comes from government. So it's quasi-market already. And so I wonder about some of that, but I think it's an excellent question. I'm going to go back to some of these prepared remarks for a little bit because I think that there are a couple of pieces missing so far in this puzzle, but I want to get to them and then hopefully we can have some more discussion of these things, and also I'll tell you why I'm thinking about it. If we think that space-based materials should be governed as a special class of common pool resources, I think it's fair to ask, says who and why? And here's where I want to get to some of the philosophical origins of value in economic systems that was kind of teased at the beginning, right? I want to cite the work of Elizabeth Anderson, who's a philosopher out of the University of Michigan. There are two ideas of hers I want to cite. The first one is that of relational equality. And the idea of relational equality is kind of simple. It's endemic to a democratic system of government, right? It's the one person, one vote, a jury of one's peers. These are ideas that are premised on a kind of relational equality that, you may be richer than me, and yet we stand as equals in the public sphere and in domains of life, right? That's relational equality. So equality is a pattern of relationships among people, not simply equal distribution of material resources. That's one of the arguments in relational equality. Relational equality applies judgments of justice to human arrangements, not some natural order. So Anderson argues that there's an enormous diversity within human beings, and the things that translate that diversity into systems of hierarchy or oppression are themselves human constructs. Relational equality is the basis for making demands on folks who are advantaged by a system. So someone who's disadvantaged can make a demand on someone who is advantaged that the system be changed. An example that I like to reference here is that of imagine a paraplegic kid who wants to go to school. They can't go to school right now because the school doesn't have wheelchair ramps and you can't go to the library because the doors aren't wide enough for you to fit through if there is a ramp and so on. In that case, that student or that person has the right to make a claim on like other folks who have designed these systems to say that, oh no, this is not fair. The system, like these institutions that you're building have to be able to accommodate me. It's a basis for that kind of argument for making claims on one another. I think that this is going to be a helpful kind of outlook when we start thinking about what's the basis for making claims for, say, common pool resource management institutions in space. To go back to the handicapped student example, like in space, you don't really need your legs for too much, so in a different context, that handicap doesn't translate to disadvantage in the way that it does on Earth. Like these are ways that we arrange our lived realities. And so we can change those lived realities. That's the big argument. And justice comes from making claims on folks to change the lived experience of systems so that they advantage the disadvantaged. So the summary of this section here is that there's a philosophical basis for alternative schemes of property rights management. And I think it can be found in these principles of relational equality. It asks how we engage one another as equals. That's the one person, one vote thing. How do you get to that? You have to have standing to make claims on other folks who are advantaged by a system. Human survival in the space environment likely requires that systems be characterized by an authoritarian techniques, as we were describing earlier. But we can still choose how those techniques translate into power, authority, and esteem by the design of our social systems that are layered on top of those biophysical realities. And I think that since space-based assets constitute a special case of common pool resources, there can be different governance structures that recruit the participation of folks according to the edicts of relational equality. The last and shortest section is about ownership as a bundle of rights and how we might start to rethink the bundle of rights that go into ownership in the space environment. So if we're talking about socio-technical systems that might promote a relational equality, we have to consider our notions of property and ownership. We've already got some ideas about what those systems might look like according to the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act. But like, what if we could think about that more critically? So there's philosopher Lawrence Becker in 1980 published this framework for thinking about rights in ownership. So he characterizes ownership as a bundle of rights. You've got various rights that we don't have to talk about right now, subject to certain limitations. And that's Becker's contribution to thinking about ownership. If ownership is a bundle of rights, we can rebundle rights to a thing as we're thinking about the management of space-based resources. So that's my argument. And I also think it's important to remember that we're already imagining certain rights associated with space-based resources in some of our laws. So if we could remix some of those, what might that look like? And here's where I want to reference the second idea from Elizabeth Anderson, that of private government. When Anderson talks about private government, she's not just talking about the state. Often when we think about government, we think about like your state government or the federal government or what have you. She sees government everywhere. One of her quips is that we spend most of our working lives in communist dictatorships where it's a kind of government. You go to work, you socialize all of the gains that you produce or the economic surplus, and that is spread out through salaries that are divided into tiers by role and so on. You have the dictatorship part is that your boss tells you what to do, and you do it according to a certain set of rules, right? So, like she says this kind of tongue-in-cheek to annoy libertarians, but I think the argument holds, right? So it's actually a bit of an achievement when we think about this government as the state. I mean, like the state used to be a very private thing. Like it used to be like the whims of kings and queens or, like an empire or something through most of human history. And that was government. The government could be a public thing as an achievement of sorts, But at any rate, let's just run through a couple of points about private government. So government, you are subject to private government whenever you are subordinate to authorities who can order you around and sanction you for not complying over some domain of your life. When the authorities treat it as none of your business across a wide variety of cases, what orders it issues or why it sanctions you. Government is private with respect to a subject if it can issue orders backed by sanctions to that subject in some domain of that subject's life, and that subject has no say in how that government operates, and no standing to demand that their interests be taken into account. The standing to demand is that relational equality piece, like that, if you were disadvantaged by a system, you have standing to demand that the system be changed. A private government doesn't allow for that. And I think we see examples of private government all over the place, but I want to give an example of this lawsuit from the U.S. Southern District in Alabama concerning hairstyles and employment. There was a job applicant who had dreadlocks who was given a job offer, and then it was demanded that she cut off her dreads to accept the job, and because she didn't, her offer was rescinded and she was fired. That's an example of private government at work, that there are these arbitrary kinds of rules and you don't get a say in them. I mean, the rationale for this is that all personnel are expected to be dressed and groomed in a manner that projects a professional and business-like image. And that's a very subjective definition if you have hair that works well in dreads and that's more manageable, right? And so this is an example of private government. Examples like this abound. And private government creates conditions of differential standing, that certain people's interests or certain people's preferences matter more than others. This is an example from Emily Gundelsberger, who worked in an Amazon fulfillment center, or warehouse, more commonly called. And she talked about the tools that she used to do her job, that the scan gun that I used every day to do my job was also my personal digital manager. Every single thing I did was monitored and timed. After I completed a task, the scan gun not only immediately gave me a new one, but started counting down the seconds I had left to do it. These are the conditions that her wherewithal, her creativity for doing her job is subordinate to to my preference to get something delivered in 1 or 2 days. I think you see this in a variety of contexts. I want to just point out a couple, right? Like denial of bathroom breaks. You have poultry workers in slaughterhouses who have to wear diapers because they don't have adequate time for bathroom breaks because we want cheap chicken. You see folks who close a shift and then start on the next one, and so they have 7 hours to go home, shower, sleep, get dressed, and then come back because we want convenience in our opening hours for service establishments. Among restaurant workers, some 90% report being subject to sexual harassment. A recent study estimates that about 7 million workers have been pressured by their bosses to favor some political candidate or issue by threats of job loss, wage cuts, or plant closure. The interests of some folks matter less than the interests of some other folks in private government. So to go back to one of the big questions at the beginning, how do you quit your job when you work in space? Well, how do you quit your job, petition for material improvements, or strike, or do any of these things that might be appropriate under the dictates of relational equality? How do you do that when your scan gun regulates your oxygen supply or manages where you can go in a space habitation? It is the thing that unlocks doors or what have you. This is more than a materialist critique. It's not just about the material well-being. I mean, Amazon workers in their warehouses get some $15 an hour in wages. They have health benefits. They have, other benefits. But the conditions are pretty nightmarish according to many descriptions. And the reason, I think the only way that we can square that circle is to realize that employees have no voice in their work and their workplaces in these systems, because Amazon's warehouses have an enormous scale, sophistication, and the sophistication of that logistics operation stamps out the ability of individual workers to have a say or a voice in how their work is done. I think that's what contributes to the misery there, not material deprivation. So it's important to think about the importance of voice in how we make sense of our workplaces. So anyway, the upshot of all this is to say that there's a more limited bundle of ownership rights might be a counterweight to the differentials of standing and esteem that derive from the authoritarian techniques of human systems in the space environment. Hopefully all that makes more sense now. By rebundling ownership rights, we might be able to advance relational equality among spacefaring humans by giving them more voice. And so I want to bring it all together for a sec with just a quick synopsis now that we've gone through this thing and we have a few ideas about what this means, right? So the space environment is lethal, absent technological mediation. Political arrangements are embedded within these technologies, and the technologies that will enable human survival in space are imbued with authoritarian politics because they require tight systems of social control and coordination. These authoritarian politics are further entrenched by broad property rights regimes, which we are currently promulgating. The reason why is because they advantage the interests of some over the interests of others. Authoritarian techniques in the technology plus broad ownership rights yields what in my formulation, the conditions right for private government. And by enclosing the common province of all mankind to create private goods, entrenches the authority and standing of the first movers who will get to that space environment. I'm arguing that instead of thinking about expansive private ownership rights in space, we should consider designating those materials as special common pool resources with a more limited or different bundle of ownership rights. Common pool resource management requires the users of the common pool resource to participate in monitoring and governing the usage of that resource. And this kind of common pool resource management system is stymied by systems of strong ownership rights. So if we think about ownership as the bundle of rights, the prerogatives of relational equality help guide our thinking about what goes into that bundle of rights. And by rethinking the bundle of ownership rights, we might be able to give people more voice in the future space economies and habitations that we'll be operating in. And I think a democracy agenda in space requires a realization of that last point. So thank you very much for your attention. I know we're a little over, but I appreciate it immensely. Thank you.